Tony. Good to talk to you today. We're looking forward to talking today about transportation as it relates to global sourcing and the risks along those lines. I know, Tony, you're involved in the transportation world a lot, and we get engaged with that with all of our customers, and we see challenges every day. So great to talk to you today, Tony.
Yeah, nope. Great to talk to you again, Brian. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world right now with some of the geopolitical tensions, but we really want to kind of focus on some of the diversifications around sourcing and manufacturing. Obviously, some of the issues that are going on in the Middle East and other issues going on around the world is driving some of that. But it's interesting that very large companies, a lot are still single sourced out of China and singular in other countries as well. One of the things that we are talking with a lot of our clients about is diversifying manufacturing into other countries, or at least assembly in other countries, basically limit that risk of the issues going on in the Red Sea, or if there are changes in tax implications coming from certain countries into the U.S. I think that what we're seeing today is many companies have not thought through and done the diversification of manufacturing and even their suppliers. And I think we're seeing that, as we saw, recently with the issues with the Red Sea and Suez Canal, and what it costs people, and not only delays, but also in now trying to get their goods from China or APAC back into the US, and how that affected their supply chain.
And I don't think people really realize what impact the supply chain has in this world until everybody remembers the global pandemic. And I remember flying to California for a project mid-pandemic, and there were so many just stuck there for days or weeks. And now there's new tensions and new challenges, but they've always been there. But I don't think people really realize the extent of what any type of tension can have in our supply chain and the impact that will have in the world.
Yeah, and there's some conflicts obviously that may not affect the U.S. Obviously we're based in the U.S., so we're more U.S. centric. But the war, in Ukraine, how much impact has it had on supply into the U.S.? Nothing like the Suez Canal has had, or even the issues that we had last year with the Panama Canal and the water being so low, right? Containers were having to, basically container ships were having to go take different routes. They would have to carry less load so that their float level was different. So I think that what we need to consider is those issues that are affecting us directly, but be cognizant of the fact that there are other things that are going on, like Brexit, like the Ukraine conflict, other disruptions where you have, strikes in France, natural disasters. I think those things have to be considered. And I think what we need to talk about basically is what are some of the mitigation strategies around that, other than obviously you should not be single sourced. Nobody should just be single sourced. You would be surprised at the large companies we deal with that are single sourced, and a lot of the smaller ones are, but look for diversification. I think the challenge is it costs more initially, right, to get set up in multiple countries, but doing contract manufacturing and looking for suppliers in different countries, I think, is a good alternative. I think that what we need to follow through on is really thinking about how we mitigate our risk by not only diversifying our suppliers and our manufacturing areas, but how do we think about transportation? We always have everything basically comes over basically from APAC, typically on a container ship. What are my alternatives if something were to happen, right? Do I have any I wouldn't say disaster recovery, but do I have any alternative plans in place to handle a Suez Canal issue, to handle a Panama Canal issue? What are some of my alternatives? How quickly could I change sourcing from APAC to another location, to LATAM or somewhere else, right? Am I prepared to do that? I think what we need to focus on is flexibility from a supplier and a manufacturing standpoint. And I know that's probably easier said than done because there's costs associated with that, right? I've got to set up, all these new trade lanes. I got to either get a contract manufacturer, or I got to set up a manufacturing facility. I've got to set up new suppliers. But at the end of the day, to mitigate supply chain disruption, it's one of the things that really needs to be given some serious thought.
As you touched on, Tony, it's very difficult to just make a quick change on your suppliers. We have a customer they make supply chain distribution related products, and currently their headquarters is in the U.S., but they're heavily sourced either in the U.S. with their own products, or they actually have some manufacturing in China. And they've been talking for a couple of years to reduce that risk. And every time they get down the road, it's like two steps forward, one step back because of the cost to do it, because of the timing, because of the challenges. And so, while that's the obvious answer is to diversify your sourcing, it's some real challenges, not just from a transportation standpoint, which we're going to talk about more, but also just from a pure cost standpoint to go in different markets in the world.
I think that visibility is always talked about a lot in transportation, but if the Suez Canal is blocked, you can't go through there. Basically, your visibility software is going to tell you that the boat's rerouting and it's going to take a lot longer to get there. But that doesn't really help mitigate the risk. Where if you had manufacturing or your suppliers in another country, then basically you could help offset some of that. So I think some of the things that we need to look at as far as that diversification goes, what's the flexibility of your software to be able to support that? Is it possible to have one of your suppliers in another country ramp up quickly? I think these are some of the things that need to be addressed and talked about. Can you source transportation at a higher volume coming out of LATAM because APAC is backed up, or there's an issue there, whether it be political or transportation related? And how do you deal with those? And then, what's the flexibility from a software perspective to quickly add additional capacity in various lanes and be able to get your supplier and or your manufacturer to ramp up production?
Well, and all of those strategies make a lot of sense. The challenge that we all have is typically what we see as the best route that exists is the one that's the cheapest and the most timely. And as we get into the details, it's one of those things where if we start looking at these other options, they're just much more costly, much more expensive. And you, Tony, you've probably seen this as much as we do. There's a lot of customers that come into an urgent challenge, and their answer is, well, let's air freight some of this stuff. And you and I both know that's the last choice and last option that we want, but it tends to be the go-to on a lot of these urgent matters. And so the more we can come up with better strategies, the more savings that we can have across the board.
Yeah, and there's some products that may make sense for air, and some people, air products, and there's a lot that happens in some of the different computer chips or things like that. However, I think again, what we're seeing some of our clients do is they're moving some of their manufacturing, into Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and I think we're even seeing some, going down to Mexico, right? And I think there's some nearshoring that is starting to happen, probably not as fast as we would like it to. We'd like to see a little bit more manufacturing being brought back into the U.S. But obviously, again, I think it goes back to what's the cost, for labor. But I think one of the things you have to consider is, at least on some of the nearshoring options, while their labor costs may be a little bit higher, let's say in LATAM, your transportation costs are typically going to be lower. I've got a smaller area. If you're coming into the U.S., basically you're through Mexico, I can basically do cross-border. I can use truck. I can then put it on intermodal. So I have a lot of options there rather than just coming solely tied to ocean shipment or the more expensive alternative, which is air. So I think what we're seeing some of our clients that we have do is they're really looking at moving manufacturing, number one, as alternatives out of China, but also looking at some nearshoring options.
Well, and those are all great things. And as we see the world changing and how we look at technology, how we look at transportation systems, everybody's been talking about the world of AI, artificial intelligence, and what's embedded in these systems. The last several years, there's things called the supply chain tower that some vendors have that can predict what some of these transportation needs may be, may predict some issues with some geopolitical issues, might even predict some things related to, I don't know, maybe the Panama Canal issue that came up. Maybe there was a way to know that. And so not to look into a crystal ball, but into the future, but understanding how future technologies may impact some of our ability to mitigate risks is also really important as we look forward to AI.
Yeah, I think this goes back to one of the points you made on one of our earlier calls is really, this is something that should probably be assessed annually. Let's do a risk assessment in this area annually. Let's make sure that we are diversifying, in the process of diversifying, have projects on the roadmap for diversifying our manufacturing and sourcing. That obviously will help. But then what are the alternatives if you do kind of the role play, right? Like, hey, what happens if something happens and we can't get freight out of China or it's delayed 30 days? How do we deal with that, right? What are the various scenarios that we can simulate? And there's probably tools out there that can do this as well. But let's look at some of the options and try and mitigate those risks.
Well, and if you look at, and I'm just thinking out loud from the standpoint of what companies and industries have mitigated risk. If you look at the automotive industry, there's so many things that are just in time from an inventory standpoint, but they are much more local, much more driven, much more focused from a technology standpoint. And getting a product from Ohio to Michigan versus from China to Michigan is a lot different scenario. And just understanding where your cars are even made. You look at General Motors, for example. At one point, I owned a General Motors car that was manufactured and designed in Germany and then made in Canada. And I thought I was buying an American-made car, but their supply chain was able to manage that more effectively by the markets they were in. And so we need to look at multiple strategies, and I think the automotive market's done some things really, really well.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think that that's one of the areas where you really need somebody that's an expert in tax, because there are different ways to, number one, beat the tax system or utilize the tax systems to most efficiently, and then also utilize any government incentives that are being given for either manufacturing in the U.S. or assembling in the U.S. So I think there's a lot of different strategies that people can enlist to help mitigate those risks and be prepared for any type of disruption. Again, whether it's natural disaster, whether it's geopolitical conflict, or we're looking at the longshoremen here, right, in the U.S., or they're in contract negotiations. So again, AI can help kind of try and predict some of these things, but I think there's others that you just really have to think through and analyze every year to make a plan on how you would deal with it and work forwards with in a project type manner where I've got real projects to help diversify my supply and manufacturing.
No, absolutely. And as you were talking about the tax and the incentives and those kind of things, that could be a potential future topic that we talk about in our conversations, Tony. I think those are really good things that a lot of companies don't think about. But I appreciate your time today. It's good to talk to you again, Tony, and it's been a great time together.
Good as always, Brian. Thanks. Appreciate it.
We probably need some good bloopers, right?
Worst case scenario, Brian, it sucks when we delete it.
Yeah, that's kind of how I'm looking at it.
Taught him it was ghost energy. See? This meeting brought to you by, Monster Energy. It doesn't show up. It's the disappearing Monster Energy drink.
Well, what's crazy about this is also sponsored by Ghost. And Ghost
that's
is the
what
one
I
that's
said. Your house is haunted, and then
it's supposed to disappear. Look at that.